There is a kind of person that civilization has always needed and rarely known how to hold. They walk into rooms and feel what is real before a word is spoken, seeing through the performances of power, the comfortable fictions that keep systems running, the masks people have learned to wear so perfectly they have forgotten there is a face underneath. What others cannot name, they carry as weight. They grieve for what the world has not yet allowed itself to grieve, and they feel the wound beneath the wound, the truth beneath the presented truth, the ache at the center of things that should be examined, but rarely are. These are the empaths, and when they are fully awakened, when they have done the work of integrating their shadow, claiming their own interior life, and standing in the full authority of their perception, they become something that the world, in its current form, does not quite know what to do with. Carl Jung spent decades studying the relationship between the individual and the collective. He understood that every society has an unconscious, a shared repository of the things the culture refuses to face: unprocessed grief, denied cruelty, the shadow of nations, of institutions, of families, of systems that depend for their functioning on certain truths remaining unseen. He also understood something that becomes important when we consider the fully awakened empath. The person who can see the collective shadow, name it, and refuse to participate in the collective denial of it, will not be celebrated by the collective. They will be pressured, marginalized, pathologized, and if the pressure fails, ignored. Because the fully awakened empath represents something that the world, in its current state, cannot accommodate: a human being who is both deeply feeling and deeply clear, who can hold enormous quantities of pain and truth at once without collapsing or performing either one, who has moved beyond the need for approval and the fear of abandonment into the steady, quiet authority of someone who knows, from the inside, what is real. Standing next to that kind of clarity is not comfortable, not if you are invested in things being other than they are. To understand why the world is not ready for the fully awakened empath, we need to understand what awakening in this sense means, and what it costs, and what it produces. The empath does not begin their life awakened. They begin it wide open, absorbing, feeling, perceiving with extraordinary accuracy, but without the tools to understand what they are perceiving or to protect themselves from the weight of it. They begin, typically, as children who felt too much, who were told they were too sensitive, who learned to manage the impossible task of living in a world that generated more emotional input than they could safely process. Many of them spent decades in this state, acutely feeling without fully understanding, absorbing without being able to set down, perceiving without being able to trust their perceptions, because the people around them consistently told them that what they were perceiving was not real. You're being too sensitive, you're imagining things, you're making everything about your feelings. Stop being so dramatic. These are not benign corrections. They are, over time, a systematic dismantling of the empath's access to their own most valuable resource, their perception. The empath who has learned not to trust what they feel is not merely inconvenienced, they are disarmed. Their central gift, the ability to feel and know what is happening beneath the surface of a situation, has been turned against them, made into a liability, transformed from a source of insight into a source of shame. This disarming is not accidental. It is, in many cases, precisely what the systems around the empath require. Families that function through collective denial need someone to absorb what is denied. Institutions that depend on compliant participants need people who have learned to override their own perceptions in favor of the official narrative. Relationships that are extractive require a partner who has been taught that their needs and perceptions are excessive. The empath in this state is useful to these systems, manageable, safe. None of these things describes the fully awakened empath, because awakening, in the Jungian sense, is not a spiritual abstraction. It is the concrete, painstaking, often agonizing process of reclaiming one's own perceptions, of learning, step by step, to trust what you feel again, to receive the information your body and your intuition have been generating all along and use it, rather than immediately suppressing it in deference to someone else's comfort. The awakened empath has done this work. They have sat with their shadow. They have faced the parts of themselves they were told were unacceptable. The anger, the desire, the need, the capacity to say no. They have grieved the relationships that could not survive their becoming more fully themselves. They have learned to distinguish between their own emotional material and what they have absorbed from others. They have built, through long and lonely effort, the capacity to be present to suffering without being consumed by it. What emerges from this process is something unprecedented in the lives of most people around them. A person who feels everything and is afraid of nothing. That is the fully awakened empath. Not cold, not distant, not armored in the brittle way of someone who has shut themselves down in order to survive, but open and solid at once, permeable to what is real, impermeable to manipulation, capable of sitting in the center of great difficulty without either collapsing or performing. Jung called this the integration of opposites, the ability to hold two things that seem contradictory without resolving the tension by abandoning one in favor of the other. Strength and softness, certainty and openness, the capacity to love and the capacity to refuse, the ability to feel deeply and to see clearly. Such integration is rare. It is the product of enormous inner work, and it produces a kind of presence that is, in practice, deeply destabilizing to people and systems that have not done this work. Let us look at what the fully awakened empath sees and why what they see is so difficult for the world to accommodate. The awakened empath sees through performance. This is perhaps the most fundamentally threatening of their abilities, because so much of social life, particularly in institutions, hierarchies, and formal relationships, is organized around performances that everyone agrees to accept as real. The performance of confidence, the performance of competence, the performance of kindness, that is actually control, the performance of humility, that is actually a strategy for avoiding accountability. Sensing the gap between performance and reality comes automatically to them, not because they are cynical or suspicious, but because their nervous system registers the dissonance the way an ear trained to music registers an instrument playing out of tune. This gift is enormously valuable in theory. In practice, it makes certain situations nearly impossible to navigate with the social ease that requires everyone to pretend the performances are real. What do you do at a meeting where the official agenda says one thing and you can feel that everyone in the room knows the real agenda is something else entirely? What do you do in a family gathering where the surface conversation is cheerful, yet you can feel the unaddressed grief and rage underneath every word? And in a relationship where the words say, "I love you," but every cell in your body knows the words are not anchored in truth, what do you do then? The awakened empath cannot not see this. They can choose not to name it, at least, not always, not in every context, but they cannot restore the comfortable blindness that makes these situations feel normal. That blindness is gone. Living without it, in a world organized around collective performances, is profoundly isolating. The empath's loneliness is the second thing the world is not ready for. Not the loneliness of someone who has no relationships, but the loneliness of someone who can see more clearly than the people around them are comfortable with, who is perceived as strange or difficult for their clarity, who often cannot find people willing to meet them at the depth at which they naturally exist. The fully awakened empath operates at a depth that most people visit only occasionally, in moments of great grief, great love, or great crisis. The empath lives there, and finding someone who can meet you in that depth, who has the interior development and the willingness to be that honest and that present, is genuinely rare. Jung understood this. He wrote that the person who undertakes the process of individuation will often find themselves increasingly alone, not by choice, but by nature. The farther along the path toward wholeness they travel, the fewer people they encounter who are traveling the same road. None of this is elitism, it is reality, and acknowledging it is important because the awakened empath needs to understand why they feel lonely, and to know that the loneliness is not evidence that something is wrong with them. It is evidence that they have gone somewhere that most people have not yet gone. There is a third dimension to the world's unreadiness for the awakened empath, and it is more subtle and perhaps more painful. The world does not yet have the language for what the awakened empath is and does. We have cultural categories for healers, for therapists, for teachers, for caregivers, for spiritual figures. But these categories each carry their own distortions, their own assumptions about how the role is supposed to be performed, what limitations the person in the role must accept, what the relationship between the helper and the helped is supposed to look like. The awakened empath does not fit cleanly into any of these categories. They heal without performing healing. They teach without setting themselves above. They care without needing to be needed. They help from fullness rather than from the wound of a healer who has not yet healed themselves. And they refuse, with quiet, gracious, absolute firmness, to accept arrangements that require their self-diminishment. People who expect anyone caring and perceptive to also be infinitely available, to prioritize others' needs over their own, to find their identity in service, find this confusing. When the awakened empath is caring and perceptive, and also sets clear limits and claims their own time and space and interior life as sacred, the categories break down. The question most people eventually ask of the awakened empath, sometimes in words and sometimes not, who do you think you are? The awakened empath knows the answer. That is precisely what unsettles. They know who they are. Not with arrogance, not with the brittle confidence of someone who is performing self-assurance to compensate for insecurity, but with the deep, settled certainty of someone who has done the interior work, who has faced what most people run from, who has earned their self-knowledge the only way it can be earned, through the willingness to look at what is there. That certainty, perhaps, is the thing the world is least ready for, because a culture organized around collective denial, around performance and approval seeking, and the management of other people's perceptions of you, has very little room for a person who simply knows who they are and does not need confirmation. The awakened empath needs nothing from you in the ordinary transactional sense. No reassurance, no validation, no permission to be who they are. They have already given themselves what they need, and this makes them profoundly free in a way that is both magnetic and disturbing. Magnetic because everyone, somewhere inside themselves, longs for this kind of freedom and self-possession. Disturbing because the presence of someone who has achieved it makes visible the degree to which most people have not. So the world develops various strategies for managing the fully awakened empath, for keeping them at a distance that feels safe. The first strategy is pathologization. The empath who feels too much, sees too much, refuses to pretend not to see, must be suffering from something, must have a problem, must need to be managed or medicated or therapized into a more socially comfortable state. The sensitivity that is actually a gift is reclassified as a disorder. The perception that is accurate is dismissed as projection. Idealization is the second strategy. The empath is placed on a pedestal, treated as a guru, a healer, a spiritual teacher, someone who exists not as a full human being with needs and limits, but as a resource for others' transformation. This strategy is more pleasant for the empath to experience, but it is equally distorting and equally dependent on the empath accepting a form of objectification. Exclusion, simply enough, is the third. The awakened empath who will not be pathologized and will not accept the pedestal is gradually edged out of social structures that depend on everyone agreeing to certain shared performances. They are found difficult, intense, too much. They are left out of conversations, of gatherings, of the easy exchange of an ordinary social life. None of these strategies is adequate to the reality of what the awakened empath is, and none of them change that reality. The empath remains, regardless of how they are categorized, precisely what they are. Jung believed, and this is perhaps the most hopeful thing he ever wrote, that the work done by the individual for the sake of their own wholeness is never only personal, that the person who does the work of becoming themselves, of facing the shadow and integrating the opposites and living from the authentic self, is doing something for the collective as well. That genuine individuation is, paradoxically, the deepest possible service to the world. Not because the individuated person sets out to serve the world, but because a person who is truly, wholly themselves, who has stopped performing, stopped distorting their perception in service of social approval, stopped shrinking themselves to fit the available space, introduces into their environment something that is irresistibly, quietly contagious. The possibility of being real, by their existence, by their refusal to perform smallness, by their capacity to feel everything and be afraid of nothing. The fully awakened empath offers the world something it does not yet know it needs. A demonstration that it is possible to be alive, fully, deeply, truly alive, in a human body, in a human life, with all the pain and complexity and beauty that entails, and not to need any of it to be different from what it is. The world is not ready for this, but the world is never ready for the thing it most needs. The prophets were not welcomed. The truth-tellers were not celebrated. The ones who felt the unacknowledged grief of their time were called unstable, dramatic, excessive. Yet the world changed, slowly, imperfectly, with great resistance and at great cost. It changed. Because certain people refused to pretend that what was happening was not happening. Because certain people felt what others had agreed not to feel. Because certain people took seriously the extraordinary, inconvenient, world-altering task of being completely, unapologetically themselves. The fully awakened empath is one of these people. It will not know what to do with them. That is all right. The awakened empath was not born to be convenient. They were born to be real. Real, however unwelcome, however lonely, however threatening to the performances and arrangements of the ordinary world, is always, in the end, the thing that lasts. The empath who has awakened fully no longer asks for the world's permission to exist as they are. They already know the answer would be complicated, ambivalent, laden with conditions. They have moved beyond needing the answer at all. They are already here, already fully present, already, in the deepest sense of the word, awake,